Okay, so welcome to another deep dive. We're going deep into the U.S. containment policy during the Cold War, so that's 1947 to 1991. Big period. Essentially what we're looking at is, well, how the U.S. tried to stop communism from spreading.
Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. And for this deep dive, we've got a lot of academic discussions to go through, really trying to understand this policy, like where it came from, how it worked, and what it means even for us today. For you all as university students especially, this stuff is really foundational.
Totally. We're talking about a strategy that shaped the whole world. And that's our mission here, to understand it inside and out, all the different parts of it, so we can see how it still plays into the global challenges we face now. It's like, think of it as building a toolkit to analyze what's going on in the world today.
Exactly right. And to really get this, we've got to go back to the beginning. The ideas behind containment, a lot of them, they come from this guy, George F. Kennan.
Right, Kennan? His long telegram, that was in 1946, and then his X article in Foreign Affairs a year later, those really set the stage. So what was Kennan saying at the core of it?
Well, he argued that the Soviet Union, it had this expansionist drive coming from two main places. One, their Marxist-Leninist ideology, like baked into their beliefs, was this idea that communism had to spread worldwide. And two, traditional Russian goals. They've always wanted historically, secure borders, regional power, that kind of thing. But, and this is important, Kennan also saw that the Soviets weren't invincible. They had weaknesses. Their leadership was often cautious.
So not this unstoppable force that some people feared?
No, not in his view. And so what Kennan proposed wasn't going to war directly, but this idea of firm and vigilant containment. Basically pushing back against Soviet pressure wherever it popped up, consistently over time. The idea was if you do that, eventually either the Soviets would change their goals or their whole system would crumble from the inside.
And this thinking, it really took hold quickly, didn't it?
It did. It was a direct line from Kennan's ideas to the Truman Doctrine in 1947. This was a huge moment. The U.S. committed to helping any country resisting communism, whether it was a threat from outside or from within. So boom, that was the blueprint for American foreign policy for like the next 40 years.
Okay, so we see the ideas, the theory. Now, how did the U.S. actually put containment into action? What were the main tools they used?
It was a multi-pronged strategy, lots of moving parts. Let's start with the economic side of things.
The Marshall Plan comes to mind right away. That kicked off in 1948. What was its impact?
So the Marshall Plan, officially it was called the European Recovery Program, and it was a massive investment. We're talking over $12 billion poured into Western Europe to help them rebuild after World War II. And to put that in perspective, that's something like $150 billion in today's money. One of our sources even says it's closer to $145 billion when you adjust it to 2023.
Wow, okay, that's serious money. Why invest so heavily? What was the strategy behind it?
The goal was to help Western Europe get back on its feet, economically speaking, make them strong. The thinking was if a country is struggling, people are desperate, that's when communist ideas can take root. So by helping these countries recover, become prosperous, the U.S. was trying to make them immune to communism, basically.
So the Marshall Plan, it wasn't just about being nice. It was a calculated part of this larger containment strategy.
Exactly. And alongside the Marshall Plan, the U.S. also used trade embargoes. Basically, they cut off certain technologies and goods from the Soviet bloc. The goal, to weaken their economy.
On the military front, NATO is a big one. Formed in 1949. What role did that play in containment?
NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, that was the centerpiece of the military side of containment. It was a collective defense pact. The idea was if one member gets attacked, everyone in NATO considers it an attack on them too. So it was a huge deterrent against any Soviet ambitions in Western Europe. The U.S. basically drew a line in the sand, saying they'd defend their allies.
And then there were all those proxy wars during the Cold War. What purpose did they serve within this containment strategy?
Proxy wars, they were kind of a way to fight the Cold War without actually fighting directly. I mean, the U.S. and the Soviet Union, they couldn't go head-to-head. The risk of nuclear war was just too high. So instead, they backed different sides in smaller conflicts around the world, like Korea from 1950 to 53, Vietnam, a long one, 55 to 75, and then the Soviet-Afghan War, 79 to 89. In each of these, the U.S. supported the anti-communist side, trying to, again, contain Soviet influence. But even though they weren't direct superpower clashes, these proxy wars were devastating for the countries where they happened.
A reminder that containment, even if it aimed to avoid a bigger war, it still resulted in a lot of suffering and instability in different parts of the world.
Yeah, that's a dark side of it for sure. And we have to remember, containment wasn't just about economics and military might. It had this whole ideological and cultural dimension too.
How did that work? How did the U.S. engage in this battle of ideas?
They used propaganda, for one, Radio Free Europe, for example. They broadcasted into the Soviet bloc, trying to spread information and promote democratic values. And the CIA, they got involved too, covertly funding cultural initiatives, like showcasing Western art, music, literature, trying to make those ideas appealing. And then there was the competition in science and technology. The space race is the big one. It wasn't just about who could get to space first. It was about showing which system, communism or democracy, could achieve more.
So it was a really complex strategy using all kinds of tools, from economic aid to military alliances to this like battle for hearts and minds. Now, containment, it wasn't static, was it? It changed over time.
Absolutely. It evolved. Each president kind of put their own spin on it. And you can really see that shift with NSC 68, which came out in 1950.
What was significant about NSC 68?
Well, it called for a major military buildup, a much more aggressive approach to containment than Kennan had originally envisioned. It was a sign that the U.S. was seeing the Soviet threat as more immediate, more dangerous.
Then with Eisenhower, we get the New Look strategy. How did that shift things?
Eisenhower's new look was about doing containment differently. He leaned heavily on nuclear deterrence, basically the threat of massive retaliation if the Soviets stepped out of line. That way, you could deter them without having huge conventional forces everywhere, which was expensive. The new look also saw a bigger role for covert ops by the CIA, like quietly intervening in Iran in 53 and Guatemala in 54. And then there's the domino theory, which really took hold under Eisenhower. This idea that if one country fell to communism, all the surrounding ones would fall too, like dominoes. That thinking was used to justify a lot of interventions later on.
And the domino theory, that was a big driver of policy under Kennedy and Johnson, especially with the escalation in Vietnam.
Oh, yeah. Kennedy and Johnson, they moved towards this idea of flexible response, meaning they wanted to be able to fight different kinds of wars, not just nuclear ones. They also started the Alliance for Progress, an economic program for Latin America. The idea there was to counter the appeal of communism after the Cuban Revolution. But of course, the Vietnam War, that became the biggest, most controversial example of containment in action, all driven by that domino theory and this belief that the U.S. had to stop these so-called wars of national liberation.
Then, under Nixon, things shifted again. We get the period of détente. How did that fit into this whole idea of containment?
Détente, it was like a softening, a dialing down of the tensions with the USSR. Nixon, he came out with the Nixon Doctrine, which basically said that U.S. allies needed to start pulling more of their own weight, take more responsibility for their own defense. He also pursued this triangular diplomacy thing, cozying up to China to play them off against the Soviets. And then there was détente itself, trying to ease those Cold War tensions through diplomacy and arms control. That led to things like the SALT talks, the Strategic Arms Limitation talks, and the ABM Treaty, the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty. So even though détente was about managing the rivalry, the core goal of limiting Soviet influence, that was still there.
And then Reagan came in and things got more, well, confrontational again.
Reagan ramped up military spending big time. He wanted to outspend the Soviets, put pressure on their economy. And then there was the Reagan Doctrine, which was all about supporting anti-communist rebels around the world. Places like Afghanistan, Nicaragua, Angola, Cambodia. He also pushed for the Strategic Defense Initiative, SDI, Star Wars, this space-based missile defense system. It was a direct challenge to this whole idea of mutual assured destruction, which had been the norm for a while.
It's fascinating how containment took on so many different forms depending on who was in the White House. But it wasn't all smooth sailing, was it? There were a lot of criticisms of containment.
Oh, yeah, plenty of people questioned it. One big criticism was that the U.S. overextended itself, got involved in too many conflicts that weren't really essential to containing the Soviet Union. Vietnam is the big example there.
And there was the moral argument, too. A lot of people criticized the U.S. for supporting some pretty nasty regimes just because they were anti-communist.
That's right. The U.S. backed dictators, strongmen, all sorts of unsavory characters, as long as they were on the right side of the Cold War, like Pinochet in Chile. It raised some tough questions about whether the U.S. was sacrificing its values in the name of fighting communism. And of course, we can't forget about the Soviet Union's own actions.
The Soviets weren't just sitting back and letting all this happen, were they?
No way. They formed the Warsaw Pact in 55, their own military alliance, a direct counter to NATO. And they were pushing their own influence in Africa, Latin America, all over. So containment, it was this back and forth, a chess match, each side trying to outmaneuver the other.
Our sources also point out some critiques from academics from different schools of thought. What are some of those perspectives?
So you've got the realists. They argued that containment focused way too much on ideology, didn't take into account the bigger picture of power struggles between nations. Like Walter Lippmann, he warned early on that the U.S. was overreaching, trying to do too much. Then you have the revisionist historians. They said, actually, containment was all about the U.S. securing its economic interests, gaining access to global markets. It wasn't just about stopping the Soviets. William Appleman Williams was a big proponent of that view. And get this, even George Kennan himself. Later on, he started to have doubts about how containment was playing out, especially in places like Vietnam. He felt it had become too militarized, too expansive.
So a really complex and controversial policy with a lot of debate about whether it worked, whether it was morally justifiable, what its true goals were. But the bottom line is the Soviet Union did collapse in 1991. Can we say containment won the Cold War?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? A lot of experts say yes, that containment was a huge factor. By keeping up the pressure for decades, exploiting the flaws in the Soviet system, it wore them down. But there were also internal problems within the Soviet Union itself. Economic stagnation, the rise of reformers like Gorbachev, the push for more freedom. It's probably a mix of both. External pressure from containment and internal weakness that brought the USSR down.
What about the legacy of containment? Did it shape how the U.S. acted on the world stage after the Cold War?
Well, some argue that it did, that this whole mindset of intervening, projecting power globally, which was at the heart of containment, that it carried over into later U.S. interventions, like in the Middle East, for instance. But there's debate about whether those later actions were truly a continuation of containment, just adapted to new threats, or something different altogether. And of course, we see the power of ideology, how ideas can fuel conflict, shape alliances, really drive events on a global scale.
So to wrap up our deep dive into U.S. containment policy, we've looked at the ideas behind it, starting with Kennan. We've seen the different ways it played out: economic aid, military alliances, those proxy wars, the cultural battle. We've talked about how it changed over time from Truman to Reagan. And we've considered the criticisms, the ethical dilemmas, the Soviet response.
At the end of the day, containment is one of the most important policies of the 20th century. It defined the Cold War, and it arguably played a big role in the Soviet Union's collapse. It shaped the world we live in today.
And on that note, here's something to think about as you continue your studies. Knowing what we know about containment, its successes and its failures, what lessons can we apply to today's world? It's a different world, now more complex. But are there any parallels? Can we learn from containment as we try to navigate the global power struggles and ideological conflicts that we see today? It's a tough question, no easy answers, but it's worth wrestling with. Thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.